Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Let's jump right in. Of course, if you'd like to sponsor a class, sponsorships are available. If helps us keep doing these classes. If you have any questions or comments, please put in the comments. We appreciate it. Okay, let's get right into it. So this week's Torah portion is Parsha Emor, which includes a discussion in this week's Torah portion about the holidays, the festivals. So let's jump into Leviticus chapter 23, verse 42. Basukos teshu shivas yamim. You shall sit in a sukkos, in huts, booths. That's how they translated it. Booths for 7 days. Kol hazachar Yisrael yeshu sukkos. Every citizen of Israel shall sit in a sukkah. L'man yedu dereisechem. So the generation should know. Ki basukos hashafti bnei Israel, because I sat the Jewish people in sukkos, in booths. When I took them out of Egypt, I am the Lord your God. Okay, so the Torah is telling us that that we have to sit in a sukkah. Why? Because God sat us in sukkahs. So let's see what the Talmud has to say about this. The Talmud says as follows. We go to Sukkah, page 11b. There's a debate amongst the rabbis what it means that the Jewish people sat in booths. The Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Ki basukos hashafti bnei Israel. We sat in I sat the Jewish people in sukkahs, as we just explained. So, Anani Akavad Hayu, Div Rabbi Eliezer. This refers to the clouds of glory. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva says, Sukkos mamash asulahem, that they actually were booths that the Jewish people sat in. Okay. So, the question is, let's try to understand this debate, number one. But more importantly, what does it mean that if the remembrance is the Torah is telling us that we're doing this mitzvah for a reason, and the reason is in order we should remember, part of the mitzvah, in fact, is that we should remember that God sat us in sukkos. We sat in sukkos. So then the question is, what is going to be the connection between the mitzvah and the way we do the mitzvah and the thing we're supposed to remember? So let's get into it. So if we say that according to Rabbi Akiva, it makes a lot of sense. The Jewish people sat in huts, so we sit in huts. So the same way that we're doing exactly what the Jewish people did in the land of in the desert when they left Egypt. However, according to Rabbi Eliezer, remembering the clouds of glory, the sukkah and the clouds of glory doesn't exactly line up. Furthermore, we know that the mitzvah is specifically done not in this time of year, in the month of Nisan, when the Jewish people were redeemed. We don't eat the Passover meal in the sukkah. We eat sukkahs in the sukkah, which is in the fall. So seemingly, if we're going to say that it's a connection to when we left Egypt, that should have been done at that time. Why are we waiting until the time of Sukkot? Now, if I go according to Rabbi Eliezer, I have this question, because the Jewish people left Egypt, immediately they had the clouds of glory, so immediately we should have Sukkot right then. However, if we follow Rabbi Akiva's version, Rabbi Akiva's opinion, that they sat in actual booths, it makes a lot of sense, because why would I need to sit in a booth in the summertime? In the spring and the summer, when it's good weather, from this time of year until the month of Tishrei. Now Tishrei comes, starts to rain, we have colder weather, so then the Jewish people would have built booths. So again, if we're saying that the connection between the mitzvah, the God is saying we're doing the mitzvah because of this, but then we're not doing exactly that. So how would I remember the mitzvah? How would I remember the clouds of glory by sitting in a booth? So now you would say, okay, so I have a debate between the two rabbis, and I have to decide which rabbi I'm going to follow. Am I going to follow Rabbi Akiva, which means that we're following the opinion that we actually sat in a booth in the desert, or am I going to follow the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer that is remembering the clouds of glory? So let's go into it. The law is that the law follows Rabbi Eliezer, even though in general the law generally follows Rabbi Akiva. So we're trying to figure out, again, seemingly the simple reading of the text would follow more Rabbi Akiva, and if the timing fits Rabbi Akiva, but nonetheless we're following Rabbi Eliezer in this case. Now let's ask some more questions. We go into the Bach, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, a very important rabbi in our Tuesday class, where we've been a little bit on pause, but where we discuss rabbis of very important rabbinical figures. We discussed the Bach, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, and he has a very simple question. Why does the Torah tell us that we should sit in a sukkah if we're commemorating the miracles that God did for us in Egypt, that when we left Egypt, there are many, many miracles that God did for us? Let's go, for example. God gave us the manna. The manna is a heavenly bread. That's a pretty impressive miracle. There was a well. So why specifically do we specifically focus on this miracle that God put the clouds of glory? Why are we focusing on that one? And furthermore, if we look at the clouds of glory, which again we said the opinion follows Rabbi Eliezer that the reason we sit in a sukkah is because of the clouds of glory. Let's look at what the clouds of glory were. This is in Numbers chapter 10, verse 34. Va'anan Hashem aleim yemim b'nisam b'namachane. The cloud of the Lord was above them by day when they traveled from the camp. Rashi comments, what does it mean that there was a cloud above them during the day? Rashi says, Shivanan ksuvim maseim. There are 7 clouds are mentioned in the course of their travels. 4 for the 4 directions, 1 up, 1 down, 1 ahead to lower the hills and raise the valleys, and to kill the snakes and scorpions. So there were actually 6 directions, and there was a cloud that traveled ahead of them to smooth out the road. Sounds like a great deal. So if we're trying to commemorate, if we're commemorating 7 clouds, one of the commentators immediately asks him, Rashi, he says, if that's the case, shouldn't the Torah have instructed us to build a sukkah with 7 sides? For sure, above and below. However, that's not the law. In fact, there are specific customs not to put a floor on the sukkah. The only thing you need for a sukkah is you need to have 3 walls, and according to the Talmud, the 3rd wall only has to be 1 handbreadth. That's about 4 inches, maybe even less, about 3 inches. So you have 2 walls, 3 inches. That's not 7. You only need the special roof is only the top. Not the other sides can be made out of any material. So why, if we're focused on this idea that it was about the clouds of glory were 7-sided, and our sukkahs are basically 3.5. It's really only one part. The top is the part that really commemorates the clouds of glory. You could live in your house and take off the roof and just put a sukkah on. So what is going on over here? Okay, let's take a look in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says, "For 7 days you shall live in booths. Because, as he quotes the verse, I had the children of Israel live in booths. These are the clouds of glory that envelop the Jewish people to protect them from the elements." Okay, so we see that the Shulchan Aruch, as we mentioned, says that the law follows the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer because of the clouds of glory. Now, let's look at the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe, as we mentioned in previous classes, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, Rishon Zalman Liadi, rewrote the Shulchan Aruch because he lived a few hundred years after the writing of the Shulchan Aruch, and all the commentators that came afterwards and debated some of the other debated the comments on the Shulchan Aruch. So because of that, he rewrote the Shulchan Aruch, and the Alter Rebbe was extremely precise in his writing of the Shulchan Aruch to make sure that it would be very clear what the law is. Let's look at the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch and the same law. He says as follows: Basukas Teshu Shivas Yamim, you shall for 7 days you shall live in booths. And he says why? So that your future generation should know that I had the children of Israel live in booths when I took them out of Egypt. So we're already noticing something different in the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo and the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe. That in the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, he just said that for 7 days you shall live in booths because I had the Jewish people live in booths. The Alter Rebbe adds a few words, quoting the verse. He says, when I took them out of the land of Egypt. And then he continues, these are the clouds of glory that envelop Jewish people for shade, to protect them from the elements. We are commanded to make a representation of them, sukkahs designed for shade to recall God's incredible wonders. So here we see, the Alter Rebbe, like we said, added the part that he says, I took them out of Egypt. And the second part is he says, why? Because God gave us shade. So what is the Alter Rebbe adding in the fact that he says that he gave us shade? And again, this is something that does not appear in the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and it also does not appear in the Arbiturim, the code that originated the style of the Shulchan Aruch, which was before the Shulchan Aruch, which created the 4 sections and that entire style. So here's the explanation. This is something the Rebbe spoke about in 1965. He says as follows: Alter Rebbe says, when I took them out of Egypt, why is he highlighting them? Because he said it's the Torah. Since the Torah says that when I took them out of Egypt, it must be that the Jewish people sat in sukkos. When the Torah says sukkos, it must be that it's immediately after the Jewish people left Egypt, which would exclude the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, because again, Rabbi Akiva said that they lived. It was actual huts, but as we mentioned, the actual huts wouldn't have been started until much later, until the time when it's colder. So, if you're saying that it's immediately following the Exodus, it must be referring to the clouds of glory, not referring to the huts. Because again, during the month of Nisan, the weather was perfect and there was no need for the Jewish people to build huts. And then we could also understand the idea why we build huts, even though it's not exactly what God did for us when we left Egypt. Why? Because we see that it actually does follow the literal meaning of the word. Of the verse. When it says, you shall dwell in sukkahs, and even though Rashi seemingly says the clouds of glory, and Rashi only focuses on the literal translation, on the simple explanation, I should say, and nonetheless, obviously Rashi felt compelled to say that it was referring to the clouds of glory because the idea that it was huts does not fit the idea that the Jewish people went out in the month of Nisan. Okay, now what's the next part? The next part, the Alter Rebbe mentions to provide shade, which again, there was in the part of the desert, in the clouds of glory that weren't in the desert, there were all these different parts. There was the floor, as we mentioned, there was the 4 sides, there was the bottom, there was the top, and the part that went ahead of them. Why is there no mitzvah to commemorate this? Okay. And as we mentioned before, why do we specifically the mitzvah of sukkah and we don't focus on anything else? And the answer is because all these other things were essential needs that God provided for the Jewish people. The Jewish people cannot survive if people were attacking them from all sides. The Jewish people cannot survive if they weren't given food, if they weren't given water. So when we're praising God for the miracles that He did for us during the Exodus, it must be that it's not just the things that are basic safety and basic survival. We're thanking God for something He gave us special, which is what? He gave us shade. We could have survived without shade. The Jewish people would have been just fine. Would have been hot, wouldn't have been so comfortable, but they would have survived. We could not have survived if we were attacked. We could not have survived without food and water. but we could have survived without shade. And the fact that God gave us shade, shows on the special connection that the Jewish people have with God. So, what's the lesson for us? Lesson for us is that we have a special connection with God. We don't just get the basics. God doesn't just give us the things that we need to survive. God gives us things to make us to be comfortable. We're actually connected to the month of Nisan. One of the things that happens in the month of Nisan, in the month of the spring, in the springtime, which in Duluth is going to start any day now. Maybe in the next few months we'll have spring. Is that the trees start to blossom, and we have a mitzvah in the month of Nisan to make a special blessing to thank God for trees. Why? To give people pleasure. Fruit is not a necessity. Fruit is not something that is essential to life. You could survive with food and bread and water. You don't need fruit. You don't need enjoyable taste. But God gave us these things. God gave us more than that. So what is the lesson for us? We realize that God gave us these things, and we should, in turn, reciprocate to God. How do we do that? By doing mitzvahs in a way that is more beautiful. We do mitzvahs in a way that is the best way, in a way that we're excited about it. We go beyond, right? So, for example, we have to put on tefillin every day. Okay, we put on tefillin. Who said we have to have the nicest tefillin? Who said that we have to concentrate every second on what we're doing for those few minutes that we put on tefillin? When we're praying, who said we have to have a beautiful prayer book? Who said we have to have a beautiful synagogue? Who said we don't? We could survive without it. And the Jewish people, unfortunately, have had times where they didn't have beautiful things. But if we have the opportunity to do mitzvahs in a beautiful way, whether it's internally or externally, we should take advantage of that because we have a special relationship with God. Because God doesn't just give us our necessities. He makes our life wonderful and gives us extra comfort